Good evening. It's Friday, August 16th, 2013. My name is Matthew Ogden, and I'd like to welcome you to our weekly Friday live internet webcast with Mr. Lyndon LaRouche. Tonight, joining me in the studio is Jason Ross, who will be posing some questions along with myself to Mr. LaRouche. We have a first question which has come in, which Mr. LaRouche has requested that we begin our proceedings tonight with. This question is from a high-level Washington source, and I will begin our proceedings by just reading this question. The question is as follows. Mr. LaRouche, despite the fact that Congress is in recess for the month of August, you and your associates have managed to keep the momentum up on Glass-Steagall. This past week's activities at the National Convention of the NCSL, the National Caucus of State Legislators, were exemplary. It has also brought to the surface a rather vast Wall Street mobilization to block Glass-Steagall. At least one state representative was heavily arm-twisted by Wall Street lobbyists to withdraw support for a Glass-Steagall resolution. This puts the issue squarely on the table. Can we allow our elected officials to capitulate to Wall Street and allied special interests when they are supposed to be operating on the consent of the governed, on the consent of their constituents? Where does the fight stand at this crucial moment, just weeks before Congress returns to Washington? And what message do you have for those elected officials who find themselves caught between their constituents and Wall Street?
Well, there's a lot of duplicity going around on this one, because the argument seems to be that Wall Street is pushing to defend its interest against Glass-Steagall. Now, that is not quite true, because the fact of the matter is, the intention is, which is being run from the British Empire, which was the controlling factor in this process. But the point is, there's no possibility of continuing this process really beyond this year. So what we're headed for is a process of cancellation of debt obligations en masse. And that will be used as a way of collapsing the economy. In other words, if you take the so-called resources, which are on the issue of the now, if you cancel those, what happens? Well, you're going to cancel the incomes of most of the people in the United States and their food and everything else. In other words, it will be one of the most horrid developments in the history of mankind. So there is no honesty there. This is most of the people who are backing this operation do not know what's going to happen to them. They're the suckers. And what the intention is to simply remember, first of all, you can no longer continue this highfalutin kind of gambling that has been going on. That's not possible. Means don't exist. And secondly, if you're going to cut that out, just cut out whole masses of debt, even this debt, their debt, you're going to simply follow that by cutting out everything for most of the human population in the United States and Europe and so forth. That's the intention. And so some of the people who are actually being the most vigorous in supporting the opposition to Glass-Steagall are themselves going to be eaten by their own, shall we say, petard. They don't have a future. Remember, the Queen has been very explicit on this subject, and she's been explicit ever since the Copenhagen campaign, to reduce the human population rapidly from 7 billion people to less than 1. And that's what the intention is. The greatest rate of death in the transatlantic region and elsewhere is intended to occur possibly in the latter part of this year. So therefore, anybody who is supporting and backing these Wall Street crowd are themselves among the mass murderers, but most of their people who are supporting them and rallying around them will probably be eaten too, or destroyed. Because what's planned, and the Queen has said it repeatedly over the past 4 years, in increasing threnodies on this subject, reduce the human population from 7 billion people to less than 1 fast.
Well, Lynn, on the motion against that, last Saturday, August 10th, a group of elected officials from Germany and France met together in the town of Arzwiller for a day of meetings and deliberation with both your wife, Helga Zeppler-Rouch, the founder of the Buzot Party in Germany, and Jacques Cheminade, the founder of Solidarité Progrès in France. The meeting was conducted in the spirit of the Élysée Treaty of '63 between Charles de Gaulle and Konrad Adenauer, which occurred exactly 50 years ago this year. At the conclusion of this summit, the elected officials unanimously supported a declaration in which they summarized their common intent for moving forward. The declaration stated that because of the failure of the national leadership in both Germany and France to rein in the financial oligarchy, whose intent it is to destroy national sovereignty and reduce the population, the nations of Europe are now facing the very real threat of a return to the fascism of the 1930s. To stop this infernal machine, they state, quote, "We believe the first step is to separate the banks, according to the principle of Glass-Steagall of Franklin D. Roosevelt, and at the same time to jumpstart their economies. They call for, quote, massive long-term investment projects based on developing man and nature from the Atlantic to the China Sea, through an understanding on mutual development among sovereign nations, and to facilitate this development, they call for the issuance of credit by national banks, which clearly means exiting the euro system, they say, which prohibits the funding of great projects with public credit. They conclude by saying, quote, we strongly support those in the United States who are fighting for the same cause and hope that their success will bolster our courage. We intend to make our initiative as public as possible while giving our own leaders no reprieve." What would you say to these elected officials and others in Europe who are fighting in parallel with the efforts of the LaRouche PAC here in the U.S.?
Well, if anyone knows history at all, knows that nobody with any guts is going to submit to this process. That only the worst kinds of cowards would not fight to the last breath, their last breath, to defeat these bastards. That's been the record of mankind, of fighters. And I'm a fighter in my own ways. I will never give up on this issue. I will do whatever is necessary to be effective, or as effective as possible, to defend my nation, defend my republic, and defend it against British and any other scoundrels who want to crush us. Wall Street, I defy them. And I suggest to my fellow citizens that they not be cowards either, and join me in defying these characters. What Wall Street intends to do is virtually destroy most of the people of this nation. And anybody who tolerates Wall Street's policy is a disgusting coward. I don't care how many threats are coming out of the Wall Street crowd against people to cause them to capitulate. No honest person faced with this kind of issue, a threat to mankind, a threat to our nation, will ever give in. We will defy them to the end. We don't care what threats they make. We will fight to the end. And we will fight not just to the end, but to the end of defeating them and removing their power. And it's only to the degree that we stick to that policy, that we allow no cowardice among us, that we're determined to defy these people to the end and beat them. And if we don't capitulate, and if we don't weep and cry and beg over, oh, I can't take any more, you take what you have to take. People have died in struggles to defend the rights of fellow mankind. And that's the way to do it. If you haven't got the guts, well, go hide yourself someplace.
Yeah, when victory is possible, defeat can't be a noble one. So let me ask you about something related to the strategic crisis. Earlier this week, you had warned about the desperation and hysteria exhibited by the bankers in their opposition to the push for Glass-Steagall at the NCSL convention in Atlanta, and that their hysteria told you that the threat of global wars is imminent, indeed imminent, unless these enemies can be quickly defeated by a victory on the Glass-Steagall front. You noted that an Israeli strike on Iran would be the kind of trigger for such an event that could precipitate such a war, which would quickly escalate to become thermonuclear, which would, in likelihood, lead to global extinction. As you know, General Dempsey has just spent the greater part of this week in Israel conducting his ongoing efforts at war avoidance. As the highly respected Israeli journalist Ben Caspit wrote, quoting a high-level Israeli military official, Dempsey's visit is not about Syria. It's not about Egypt. Dempsey went, quote, to make sure Israel has no surprises up its sleeve in connection to Iran, he said. Patriots among the military and the intelligence leadership around Dempsey continue to reflect concern about the possibility of some reckless action in the region that could put the entire world, not just the Middle East, in jeopardy. Meanwhile, the situation in Egypt becomes more dangerous, although much of what we're reading in the U.S. press is a gross distortion of the facts on the ground. The Egyptian people are in support of their military's attempts to bring peace to the country in face of the violence being committed by the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist terrorists. There continues to be open hostility among the Egyptian people for the policies of Obama and his representatives, including Ambassador Patterson, as well as Senators John McCain and Lindsey Graham, who visited the region and stuck their noses in it last week. Ahmed Zind, the chairman of the Egyptian Association of Judges, said that John McCain should, quote, be arrested for trying to destroy Egypt. And Raymond Ibrahim, an associate fellow at the Middle East Forum, stated that, quote, McCain's call to release Brotherhood leadership validates the widespread belief in Egypt that America is a fellow conspirator with the Brotherhood. He said that Egyptians believe the U.S. fears that Morsi and others, if put on trial, would reveal the nature of their cozy relationship with the U.S. government, leading to any number of ugly revelations, including treasonous ties and conspiracies. So let me ask you, where do you see the war danger right now, and how do you see the confluence of the conflict erupting in Egypt, Syria, Iran, Israel, and the rest of the Middle East, intersecting here the desperation and hysteria being exhibited by Wall Street in their attempts to stop the juggernaut for Glass-Steagall forming here?
Mm-hmm. Well, you don't try to break this down into components, because what you're dealing with a global policy which has been formally in operation since the assassination of John F. Kennedy. If you look carefully at the history, which I've had the privilege of, because of my age, of knowing and experiencing, this has always been from the beginning. From the time that John F. Kennedy was assassinated, the world went on a new course for a new world war, but of a special kind, a follow-up of World War I and World War II. It's really World War III. And that's what's on the stake now. So there is no consideration for any special factor in this business. In fact, the crucial issue here is 9/11. Because what is at stake is 9/11 is being carried out by its authors. The authors are the British Queen and the Saudi Kingdom. 9/11 was a combination of the British Queen, of the military unit of the British Empire, and by the Saudi Kingdom. And these are the forces which continue from the present time, especially from 9/11 time. It's been continued continuously without interruption and without diversion. So what you already have is you have a presidency of the United States now, and at the highest level, is covering up for the role of the British monarchy and of the Saudi kingdom in 9/11. They're all guilty. The whole crowd are guilty. They're traitors to the United States. And they committed high crimes and misdemeanors, and not just misdemeanors, crimes which virtually called for the death sentence against the presidents or other leaders of these countries, including traitors who are in the United States government, traitors who are represented in part by presidents, recent presidents of the United States, who were the people who covered up the lie of 9/11. That 9/11 was done by no one but the British Queen, the BOE military incapacity, and the Saudi kingdom. And they did it explicitly. And George Bush's family was an integral part of the accomplices. If you want to talk about this issue, that's what you have to bring forth on the thing. Everything else is a fraud. Everything else is fake.
I can mention on that note that the lead item of this week's EIR, Executive Intelligence Review, is a long expose written by Jeffrey Steinberg on precisely this issue, with all of the background, with all of the collusion between the Saudi ambassador, both Presidents Obama and Bush. So that's available. The next question comes from Mike Billington, who is the editor of the EIR Asia desk, and who recently returned from a trip to China, where he conducted a series of significant meetings with various representatives of certain leading institutions. This is his question. Lynn, I have a question from the standpoint of my recent trip to China. He says, in recent discussions with leading Chinese officials and analysts, they have expressed a deep interest in your ideas concerning the necessary solutions to the global strategic and economic crisis. They recognize that the ongoing collapse of the European and American economies threatens to provoke a disastrous crisis within China as well, which has based its economic development since the 1980s on using its cheap labor to produce consumer goods for the West. The new government under President Xi Jinping has committed to moving away from this export dependence towards internal demand based on large-scale infrastructure projects both within China and in Africa and other developing regions, and on expanded development of nuclear power, their space program, and other advanced technologies. However, they are worried that they are not prepared for the impact of the crash in the West. They are also aware that the Obama administration is pursuing a confrontational policy towards China, both strategically with the air-sea battle plan for a war on China, and economically through efforts to isolate China through an anti-China free trade pact, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is now in the planning stages. In your recent interview with China's leading news service, Xinhua Net, you emphasized that the near-term threat of thermonuclear war, if the Glass-Steagall reform is not implemented immediately, wiping out the power of the British monarchy and the City of London Wall Street oligarchy. The question is, how do you see China's role in solving this existential crisis, and what role can China play in the economic and cultural renaissance which you are working to implement?
Okay. Well, you're in a situation in which, if we do not have thermonuclear war, which is the threat now, then you have the danger that follows from failing to do something about this mess that has already been created. In other words, if this continues, then we're going to have to do a number of things. First of all, the elimination of this war threat, which now comes largely from the British Queen and accomplices of the British monarchy in the world. And the Saudis, of course, are among the leading culprits in this matter. I mean, what the Saudis are doing against Egypt, with the complicity of idiots in the United States, and high-ranking idiots in the United States, and they're high in the sense of odor as well as other aspects. But if that does not go through, if that is defeated, then we have a problem of rebuilding a world which has been largely destroyed through the influence centered in the British monarchy, or the British and Dutch monarchy, if you want to get the full repertoire. Therefore, we're going to have to make fundamental changes very quickly, and we're going to have to do it from a standpoint of scarcity and the poor available resources. Obviously, we're going to have to generate high technology driver programs going to the highest level. First of all, cut out the green policy. Eliminate the whole green policy of Europe and the United States. The green policy is insanity. It actually will destroy the human population. You cannot accept it. So therefore, that means we're going to a high technology alternative. That doesn't mean we're going to suddenly leap into miracles. It means we're going to struggle as Roosevelt had to struggle in his first term as president. He had to struggle in order to build the foundations for the beginning of development of a recovery move. We didn't have a recovery. What Franklin Roosevelt did in his first term was to lay the basis for recovery. In the meantime, we were continuing to support the efforts of people to find employment, to improve their condition, and so forth. So we're going to do the same thing, which means that we've got to increase the productivity per capita of the populations of the employable, and we've got to improve the education of our people, our children. And now what we begin getting is the absolutely opposite direction. In the recent period, the intellectual level of our children has dropped catastrophically. So they're no longer fit to be employed as future employees in any significant role. They don't have the training, they don't have the orientation. We're going to have to repair this kind of problem. We're going to have to introduce as much high technology as driver programs. For example, one of the things that happened in this period was we shut down our entire high technology capability, or the gut of it. So now we have whole areas such as Detroit, which was destroyed by this government, by the federal government, destroyed Detroit. I was involved in that, in the defense of that, trying to keep the auto industry and related industries in the United States functioning, knowing that if we canceled those capabilities, we were going to destroy the economy. And that's what happened. We now have a no economy, because essentially the gut of a real economy is collapsed. Look at everything is collapsed. Water systems are collapsed. Mass transportation, education, everything, healthcare has been destroyed. So therefore we're going to have to go back to that, building that. We're going to have to take the remnants of high technology and things that we can do that with that method, and begin to build up, as Roosevelt did in 1933 on, to begin to build up in the United States and in other places, to build up a high technology intention, which means that we're going to push wherever we can for high technology. And that's the way we'll handle it. That's the way Roosevelt handled it. Roosevelt started from 1933 when he got into office, actually. And from that point on, he was a driver program up until the moment he died. And that's happened before. It happened with, back in the 1930s or 1830s. It began the same way. 1820s and 1830. It became the same way. After Lincoln, the same thing. We have done it repeatedly. Other nations, Germany, Bismarck's reform was based on the model of the Civil War program of Lincoln. And that was destroyed in 1890, which caused exactly at that point, Bismarck's being ousted, opened the gate immediately for the First World War. And then the second one, the same way. So what we have to think about is now getting rid of this mess, taking immediate action, corrective actions, by using technologies which we know we have or could have, and put them to work immediately, just the same way that Franklin Roosevelt did from 1933 on. And it's going to be longer than that. It will take us probably 30 or 40 years in order to even get a real build-up of the type we want to talk. But we're going to increase the performance. We're going to devote everything. And we're going to be able to do it because we're not going to have the British monarchy anymore. We're not going to have the Saudi monarchy anymore. We're going to have nations which are willing to devote themselves to cooperative programs amongst sovereign states. Because if you want to build an economy in the world, you have to build it on the basis of sovereign nation states. And cut out all this as if and above. So therefore, we have to think with China right now. We have to think with China and with Japan, which will, our people in Japan who will actually do much good in that thing, the whole Southwest Asia project. And we're going to have to, or Southeast from our standpoint. But we're going to have to do that, and we know that we have resources which can be mobilized. Simply go to high technology and go to the things that mean high technology. Just improve things. Raise people's standard of living, their standard of technology, their confidence above all, their self-confidence, that they can be conditioned in a fairly short time to realize that we are determined that they shall succeed. And if we just stick to that consistently, we can inspire in them gradually the confidence that we mean business. And what we have to look at is shut this British operation down, shut down the British Empire, shut down the Saudi kingdom. They should not exist. If you want to have peace, for example, in Egypt, shut down the Saudis and the British. The Saudis and the British are the ones who are running that whole scandal in Egypt. The present government of Egypt is sound. It's the Saudis, the same Saudis that ran 9/11 against the United States in collaboration with the British. That's the enemy. These guys I know, and other people know, these guys are guilty of 9/11. The Saudi kingdom was guilty of 9/11. The British monarchy was guilty of 9/11. We know that. It's a fact. And what's behind the Saudi attack on Egypt is 9/11. Again, the same crowd that caused 9/11. They are the enemies of the United States. The Saudis who are being used for these purposes are acting as enemies of the United States. And this dumb president that we have now apparently doesn't believe that. He himself is in the same route. So we're at a point now where we have to think about not how we can cure the past. You can't cure the past. The past is dead. You have to build the future. And what we have to do is have an approach to eliminate the past by building the future. And that's the only thing. Now, what China is doing itself, what's coming out of China, what's coming out of some leading figures in Japan, and similar kinds of things, what's looking at Southeast Asia, Southeast Asia, rather, looking at that whole circle, that waterbound system. And if we cut the Kra Canal through into the Indian Ocean, we will have a revolution in South Asia from just doing that, by just cutting through that isthmus of the Crocodile Isthmus, when putting an adequate piece in there, in opening that whole area to a maritime culture, a different kind of maritime culture, which will build up that area to bulwark other parts of the area. So we have the thing we have to do is don't get ourselves tied up in how do we deal with this knot. We just have to get rid of those knots. And we have to knot the knots. And that's what we have to do. Therefore, we have to fight to clean up our own government, to purge our own government of its treasonous elements, of those who are treasonous because of their stupidity. A couple of members of Congress, I think, fit that category. And we have to get peace, but we can't just sit there with peace. We've got to start rebuilding what was being destroyed by the British Empire with the help of the Saudi kingdom. And that is the only possible road to a solution from the horror that we face right now.
I want to ask a follow-up question, just to elaborate some of the points that you just made. As is clear throughout our history, every time a great president has built an ambitious project, such as Abraham Lincoln with the Transcontinental Railroad system, that was mirrored in Russia by the Trans-Siberian Railroad, or what Franklin Roosevelt did to build large-scale water and power management projects when he went to Yalta on his summit with Churchill and Stalin. Flying over the Sahara Desert, he said, "We could make that desert bloom. All you need to do is add some water." So every time we've built great projects, we've inspired the rest of the world to do the same. Today, when we're speaking about the great project such as the nuclear Nawapa 21, replenishing the drawn-down aquifers in the southwest United States by averting water from the Alaska coast, which flows into the Pacific Ocean, what you've discussed is that this is not a rebuilding of the United States, it's not a reindustrialization, but it's what we would call a new industrialization. It's a completely different platform of technology, which we have not yet heretofore achieved. So we're going to take Detroit, for example, and take this machine tool capacity to retool it and build a completely new technology that we haven't had prior to now. Now, on the remarks that you were just making, this Nawapa 21 project opens up the entire Pacific Basin to the United States, something which is not yet, we have not developed to our fullest capacity, our role as a Pacific nation. Not only does this bring the railroads and the transportation corridors into Alaska, opening up the possibility of the Bering Strait Tunnel project, which actually has been on the books since Abraham Lincoln's time, but it also opens up our relationship with not only Russia, but the other great Asian nations such as China, Japan, India, and so forth. Now, what my question is as we construct this project in the United States, in parallel with the great projects that can be built in Southeast Asia, such as the Kra Canal, as you've referenced, and others, how in a post-British Empire world, in a post-imperialism world, how does the relationship between great nations work? You've mentioned prior to this ideas such as high technology sharing and ideas such as that. How does that function? And also, how do we extend the American system, credit system, the Hamiltonian credit system, to include great nations such as China, Russia, and others?
Well, there are 2 points I think I would stress. First of all, our organization, despite its limited personnel and limited resources, has shown itself to be able to lead this nation. Not by our being some kind of dictator or something, but simply because we are doing things that other people increasingly would wish to join us in doing together. That's the first part. And that's what we have to base ourselves on. That if we can affect now, because Wall Street is the enemy of the United States. It's a British enemy of the United States, but it's an enemy of the United States. Everybody leading in Wall Street is a criminal. Therefore, they have to be removed from power. Whether they're imprisoned or not is another question. But their industry, their main source of income, is going to be shut down. Wall Street is going to be shut down. We don't need it. It's bad for us. It's bad for our health. It's bad for our economy, for everything. We're going to shut that down because we have to shut it down because it's a disease. And we have to stop diseases. And Wall Street is a disease. So that's number one. Now, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to make a leap. And the leap is called thermonuclear fusion. We're going to have to base a policy based on the development at a rush job on developing thermonuclear fusion. It's because if we use thermonuclear fusion, and rather than something else, we can accomplish things which are necessary for the United States and other nations now. It is the energy flux density which we can bring to bear in practice on the economy that determines the possibilities and limitations of an economic recovery. So therefore, if we really want to get a real recovery of the U.S. economy, if we want to have a world which is based on something apart from this crap we've been living through, we're going to go in that direction. We're going to go to thermonuclear fusion because that's the only source which gives us sufficient density for the leading kinds of projects which are required among all the other projects. In other words, if you want to really build up the water system of the United States, which is now in despair, without thermonuclear fusion, you really can't do it. You can't do it effectively. And if you take the other parts of the world, if you want to take desert areas and turn them into golden areas, that's the way to do it. We know how to use water in a better way to make it accommodate this thermonuclear fusion approach. And in the meantime, we're going to have to worry about the defense of a planet against big rocks, which come in and threaten to blow and kill everybody on the Earth. Could be killed by some of these big rocks if they're big enough and come fast enough. So we're going to have that kind of capability to both for our defense and also for our progress. And that leadership, so we will take the kind of machine tool design that we had with the auto industry and what it represented from that period on. We take that, we energize it. We give it the backing of thermonuclear fusion and things approaching that, which will transform our productive powers from modest to more impressive. And this is what we need to do because the problems of the atmosphere, of the territory, the agricultural features and so forth of the entire planet require drivers which are of higher order of magnitude, or higher energy flux density. And with that, we can do something. But to take the water problem in the United States, without thermonuclear fusion, we really cannot promise an early happy result. We've destroyed the United States. Monsanto has helped us destroy the United States with their agricultural policy. So we need a real booster. We're not going to have thermonuclear fusion on every block, but we're going to have certain big driver projects, including water projects and other things of that type. We're going to use that as a way of getting a driver, an energetic driver, which will enable us to get above the modest levels that we had when we were producing. And that's the answer. But you don't win a war by trying to refight it. You win a war, including an economic war, by going to a higher level of motivation. Don't stick to the old hat take a leap forward, a leap higher. And that's what we have to do here in the United States and what we're doing. You know, we are, despite our small numbers, we have putting a factor into this system, which our enemies have come to realize is our factor. And we use that factor that we represent. And with permission from our fellow Americans, we will pull a team together which is capable of undertaking the kind of mission for today that would fit what Franklin Roosevelt did in his time.
Now, let me ask you this final question for the evening. This is a question that comes in from our neighbors to the south, from Alberto Vizcarra, a longtime associate of ours and the leader of the pro-Pleno movement of Sonora, Mexico. Here's his question. He says, "Dear Mr. LaRouche, old friends of yours, together with agricultural producers, businessmen, and citizens from southern Sonora, who have for years fought for great water management projects for Mexico, such as the Pleno and others, now face a strategic battle. Since we directly face the financial interests which, through the World Wildlife Fund, have taken control, in large measure, of water policy in Mexico, and intend, using a criminal who currently occupies the governorship of this state, to divert the waters of the Yaqui River into speculative schemes, threatening thereby the existence of the Yaqui Valley and the Yaqui Indian tribe. The pretext is that water should be where it produces the most money, and they believe that using water for agriculture is a waste. It was thought that with the new Peña Nieto government in Mexico that these policies would change, but so far this has not happened. They want to destroy the region which had become Mexico's grain basket and which was the cradle of Norman Borlaug's Green Revolution, the region which was emblematic of a policy oriented to food self-sufficiency. What do you recommend to the President of Mexico in light of this situation?"
Well, this is a project which is really tied very closely to the United States, because Canada and the northern part of Mexico in particular is an integral part of our territory, which has to be pulled together in order to deal with the mutual problems of the three nations. Canada has a lot of water available, for example, but they lack other things. Mexico has a shortage of water, a great shortage of water in the northern parts, but they have other things. So therefore, obviously, the primary thing in Mexico is water development. It's a crucial thing. We need, water development of water resources, particularly in the northern part of Mexico, where it's needed. What happened is when Kissinger got involved in something at his time back, at the time that I was pushing for our friends in Mexico, the president of Mexico was my personal friend. And were working together to build something in Mexico. We had a plan for 10 large nuclear plants in Mexico to help deal with the water problem in order to develop up city areas which were not so hot that people couldn't live there in the summer season. These kinds of projects. And that's what we were involved in. It was a cooperative effort among us, emotionally, politically. We saw a common interest between the United States and Mexico, which is rather obvious, since they were close relatives in a sense. So therefore the idea is, how can we help develop the northern part of Mexico, which is the vulnerable part in terms of the water resources? And by doing that, and by putting in some nuclear power plants in there as sources for pumping this thing and changing the climate, we could go ahead and change it. But then you had Henry Kissinger was part of this problem. He was sent down to Mexico to sabotage what we planned to do. And he did a fair job of sabotaging what we intended to do. But he was not the author of it. He was only the accomplice. And so that happened. Now, what we have to do as a perspective is forget this particular presidency in Mexico now. We have to think about a change in the overall orientation of both the United States and Mexico, and in cooperation with Canada. Because the water resources of Canada and other things of that type, combined with what we have in the United States as potential, and what we have in northern Mexico, if you combine these things as a cooperative venture among three nations, you can solve the problem. What you need, we remember the problems of government in Mexico. The problems of government in Mexico came from outside of Mexico. The destruction of the presidency of Mexico came from outside Mexico. And the whole drug problem, everything else going with it, is a result of people meddling from outside of Mexico. The drug problem we have in the United States, in the southern borders of our United States, and the drug problems we have in Mexico, are a reflection of this kind of treasonous garbage. I was in the middle of this thing. I was part of the thing. I was cooperating with the Mexican government on trying to bring this around, and other nations in South America as well. And they just got around to getting rid of me. But what I had stood for, what I initiated, what I played a role in South America generally, as in this case, was what we did, what we intended. And these other guys, directed by the Queen of England at that time already, made a mess of it, made a mess of everything. They made a mess of Mexico. Now you've got some people who are in Mexico who are not so nice in government. Well, they are a product of the British monarchy. And the British monarchy, I think, should take a time out for a while and get themselves sorted out again, because I'm sure there are many people in the British Isles, for example, who have better things to do than kiss up to the rear end of a British monarchy.
Well, I actually have one last follow-up question to conclude. I think that people are aware, and a lot of people who are watching the webcast tonight have participated in congressional town hall meetings that are happening all around the country. And these congressmen have had no place to hide when they've gone back into their districts, because they've been confronted by citizens with justified rage, we could say. And a lot of people have been picking up on this. National media has been covering the fact that these town hall meetings are getting pretty explosive. Now, we have a little bit over 2 more weeks where these congressmen have got to be facing down their constituents in these districts. And I know a lot of people who are watching this webcast are probably preparing to, in the next few days or so, go and see their congressman or go and see their senator. And we, as we mentioned in the beginning of this webcast, we as a movement have not gone on recess. We have managed to maintain the fight for Glass-Steagall and for the defeat of Wall Street, as exemplified by not only what happened in Atlanta this week with the NCSL, but also the fight that we're continuing in California, in Sacramento, which is very hot, and everywhere else around the country. So I know our viewers will appreciate it if I ask this question, but what are your marching orders for everybody out there over the next coming weeks until Congressman returns to Washington? And what is the message that they can bring from you to these congressmen?
Well, that's not too hard for me to answer to. No, what we have to do is we have a certain intellectual capability as an organization. And we don't have more than that. We have that. But it happens we live in hard times when the intellectual life of our nation is in poor shape too. So there are certain things that I know, that we know as an organization. We've tested this and we've tried this out and it works. All we need is more push, and also keeps me busy thinking of flanking operations in which to catch these guys on the assumption that maybe I'm a bit smarter than they are, and I'll flank them and thus create an opportunity for us to accomplish something. What we're having now, as you know very well, what we're getting now is we're getting an accelerated response to what we are doing because we are providing the quality of leadership which in principle it seems that nobody else is doing. There are the good things happening in New York State, good things happening here and there, good programs, good ideas. But you need something more than that. You need a punch. You've got to hit a flanking operation. You've got to outflank this problem because you cannot just push against it. You have to let it come in where it gets into a position where they have outflanked themselves, and then you can do something about it. And that's what we've been doing. We've been running flanking operations against what the so-called high-ranking this or that, high-ranking that. The smell is high-ranking. And that's what it is. I just flank this stuff myself. I've had a lot of experience. I'm not in the best shape I was in my skein of my living. I'm not in such good shape there. But considering how dumb our government is, I feel pretty good and smart, but only for that reason.
Okay, and on that concluding note, we'll conclude the webcast. So thanks, Lynn. Thank you, Jason, and thank you everybody who was watching. Good night.